Hey everybody, Art Bell was one of the greatest influences on my life. I really enjoyed doing the Art Bell Halloween special. I wasn't entirely sure if I was going to do a follow-up on that on this channel, but I think that it definitely deserves it. Not because necessarily I have too much to add, but I found a handful of comments that I really liked that actually helped me sort of round out some of my thoughts on it a little bit, so I'm just gonna jump right into your comments with this one. DeadlyDanMann says, I learned about the multiverse theory from his show when I was 24, and that led me to want to learn more about the universe and quantum mechanics. He helped expand people's way of thinking and actively encouraged it. Amazing man. Yes, and that's why Art Bell is one of my heroes, one of my greatest influences, and definitely one of the greatest influences for the Tell Me More series. My greatest wish would be that one day I can be the next Art Bell. But that was my favorite part about the show too, is it introduced me to so many new concepts that I had never heard of before. I really loved all the guests that he'd have on the show, because they would end up coming from fields that I'd never even heard of before, or they'd end up being people that came from really popular fields like ufologist and crop circle expert Linda Howe, who was on the show like a million times, almost every month or every week I think she was on there. That's how I got introduced to David Paulides' Missing 411 series as well. He was on the show at least twice, but it might have been more than that. And at the peak of his career, I think he was getting somewhere around 50, I'm probably getting this wrong, but it was over 15 million viewers at one point. So the fact that he was able to do essentially a mainstream show, a 2 a.m. late night red-eye show, and he was able to invite on these guests that would introduce such interesting concepts that you would never see on television and you would definitely never hear about on regular radio. That was so fun. And that's why Art Bell is probably the greatest influence that I had getting into the whole skeptic, supernatural, unexplained field that I love so much. BMT says, this one is actually true. My story my dad told me from when he was in his early 20s. My dad and his buddy were on a trail in the backwoods of Louisiana, and they were riding mountain bikes. My dad's friend saw something catch his eye, and they pulled over off the trail and went to see what it was. They saw a small abandoned house, pretty well hidden by the tree line, and he just happened to see it. They saw a bunch of people dressed strange, acting weird, and got spooked. They quickly left the area and called the police and security for the park they were riding through. From what he told me, the cops reported that it was a satanic cult out in the bayou sacrificing animals for a ritual. Weird shit. See, that is a perfect story. Everything about that is believable because there's nothing obviously supernatural in it, nothing that makes me question my reality. So I know that it's well within the possibility. But it's still a very creepy thing, and I was able to sort of put myself in the shoes of the people witnessing it, even though there was like 2 degrees of separation between the storyteller and the person that actually witnessed it. So I just included this because it's a perfect example of something that Art Bell would love to feature on his show. Though I would suggest if you were to call into the show, I would pretend that I was the one that witnessed it. Chris Hodge says, my absolute favorite segment was when someone would call into his Antichrist hotline, which was reserved only for the actual Antichrist. It is where I first fell in love with his way of dragging out the conversation. Also, great was his conversation with John Titor, the time traveler. The Antichrist hotline thing was a really neat novelty. There were a few people that called into it, so obviously some of them were lying. But I think that was a really fun way to show how his audience like to role play, they like to make stories up, or they like to really get into the characters that they were trying to portray in their stories. And the Antichrist thing, I don't think I ever would have called into that. That's a little too cringe for me, but there were a couple of really good examples of Antichrist. And you could tell that the people didn't really have much to say. They didn't have a lot planned. They just wanted to seem eerie. And Art Bell, just like this guy said here, he would be the one to sort of create a conversation out of it. He would draw out details. He would get the person to sort of explain himself, his motivation, and like what kinds of things he wanted to do. And those were really good examples of how he could sort of flesh out something from almost nothing. And the John Titor time traveler thing, that was really interesting too. That's actually one of his most classic episodes, and I would suggest looking that up. I don't really believe it, but there were some really interesting details in the time traveler story, some that actually ended up being true. Obviously, a lot of them ended up being false, but I remember when that first happened, listening to that segment, and it really drew me in. That was a very fun episode. Scuba Steve says, that guy who found the USO was not a captain, or in the industry. You don't use side-scanning radar, you use side-scanning sonar. That's something I noticed too, and I remember bringing that up when we were putting the episode together, that was something that I didn't really believe about it, but I left it out of the main video just because I didn't want to ruin the story. But the captain of a ship that uses sonar would know what sonar is and the difference between sonar and radar. Radar is for reading things that are above the surface of the water, and they were specifically scanning below the surface of the ocean. If that's a mistake, that's a really dumb mistake for the captain of the ship to make, but, you know. And that's not a mistake you would make as a mariner. Oh, well, I stand corrected. And he made the mistake more than once, so I don't believe him. As a US Navy submariner, I can say I've seen lots of weird lights and shit in the ocean. But okay, I'll play along. What if it were a mine or an ocean gas line? Maybe he did hit a Russian sub or an old wreck. The explosion could have lifted off of the bottom. That was something I considered too, but I'm glad that somebody else pointed that out. That certain types of explosions under the water will sort of lift the surface of the water up, and if it's a big enough explosion, it'll cause light. And I think the detail of the story was that it was later in the night when it happened. So with the absence of direct sunlight on the surface of the ocean, it would have been more, the light coming up from underneath the ocean would have been more prevalent. I think that it is possible that their little buoy that they were using below the surface to do scanning, that did hit something. That part of the story I absolutely believe. But I don't think he ever said that something literally lifted right out of the ocean. He just saw the surface lift and then some light. And yeah, that could have been a litany of different things. And I think that it is more likely that they hit a Russian sub or like some sort of a secret earthbound sort of piece of technology or a submarine, you know. But, you know, it might have been a gas line. They might have actually caused a subsurface explosion. That would have actually been an interesting explanation for what happened. But yeah, I don't really like the detail of him getting the sonar wrong. That took me out of the story. Also, one pass with a side-scanning sonar pod would not have given you enough detail to ascertain what it is. Usually you have to make multiple passes to get a good look at it. Yeah, and I guess that's sort of why he believed it was an USO, an unidentified submerged object, because they weren't actually in a position where they were able to turn back around and check it out again. But I think I would have believed in that situation, because the way he described it in his story, it was separated from the bottom of the ocean, but definitely below the surface. So it was some sort of submerged object. It was definitely a man-made or an intelligently made object. It wasn't something natural. But for him to just assume that it was something alien-like, that's a bit dumb. I would say that is kind of the nail in the coffin of the USO story. Cascadian Ranger says, 6 guys is about the bare minimum for an ambush, but northern firebases were notoriously understaffed. You don't have to press out ambushes all the time, but it's vital, and you might not have many men to spare it. Yeah, and that's another thing that you learn about the Vietnamese War in the movie Apocalypse Now, which is something I mentioned during the Art Bell episode. The further north you get in the Vietnam War, the more scattered, the less staffed, the less supplied those bases were. There was very little focus on those positions. It was very stressful for the soldiers that worked there. And though they weren't technically supposed to go into Cambodia, they were near Cambodia because they were trying to run cover to stop stuff from coming in from Cambodia. But the point is that, yeah, it seemed dumb to me at the time when I first listened to that story. It's like, why would you send 6 guys out to do an ambush against an entire regiment of Viet Cong? Thinking about it more, the point of an ambush is not to sit there and sort of dig in and fight that regiment one-on-one on equal terms. The point is to hit them hard and fast and then get out of there. Yeah, I guess that sending more than 6 people could actually make it more complicated. You know, 6 people makes it so that they can get more mobile, they can move quicker, and they're gonna be harder to find after they leave the site. Ambushes rely on speed and surprise and are the most noteworthy way for a small force to effectively fight against an overwhelmingly numerous enemy. I just said that, all right? Don't try to steal my thunder. But anyways, thanks for the comment. So this guy just wanted to confirm that the location mentioned in the Ghost Girl story is true. Goat Boy says, hey, Las Vegas local here. I know exactly where he was talking about. The corner of Lake Mead and Boulder Highway is actually near where I live. Well, that might be a lie, but I'm gonna assume you're telling the truth. That road does lead into what was desert back in the day, like 2003 to 2013. However, construction began around 2010 for some housing projects and strip mall buildings. Currently, there's a condo complex up there called Camden's, and a Walmart and shop complex. Are you like trying to encourage tourism to this area? At the time that the story was told, all that was really back there was some construction stuff. So it's likely it was development stuff for some of these structures. That's what he's getting at. But what's funny though is I did get another comment very similar to this that said that that area doesn't exist or that that road doesn't lead that way. And it's possible the person that left that comment doesn't know that today's layout of that area is different from back then, but who knows? If he described the area accurately, that was near the old service road where there's some power transformers that are fenced off. It's a very common place for car lovers and kids to smoke. It's incredibly dark in that area because it's out of the way of the Vegas lights, and the mountains nearby obscure the moon till around 2 a.m. That's a really interesting detail. I'm surprised that either you know that, you're pretty familiar with the area. Are you one of these car lovers or are you one of the smokers? But I guess like that makes sense. If it is like in a small valley between the mountains, you can't really expect there to be too much natural light there in the middle of the night. His story sounds credible to me and his locations are spot on. The feet thing though, that's incredibly strange. Yeah, the ghost didn't have any feet. That's how they knew it was a ghost. I chose this next comment because it mentions some of the best episodes of Art Bell, and you're definitely gonna wanna look some of these up. But if I do another Art Bell episode, I'm obviously going to include some of this. Nicholas Bowles says, I love Art Bell. There's definitely a second episode here. You missed one of the big stories, like the guy who flew a plane into Area 51 and supposedly was shot down on the air. There was actually a couple people that said they've been to Area 51 or they've been near it or that they worked there. But the one where the guy said that he flew over it and was shot down, that's one of my favorite Art Bell episodes of all time. That is either some great acting or an amazing tale. Or the bottomless mystery well that apparently was some kind of interdimensional portal, which was a multiple call story arc over several airings. I don't actually remember all the episodes for that. Or probably the most famous was the Area 51 caller who was running from the Men in Black, claiming aliens were real, then later called back to say it was all BS, like he had been forced to retract. So many stories, so little time. The really interesting thing about that story is there was I don't know if it's the same guy. Probably, it sounds like it's the same story. But there was a guy that called in. He was like very stressed in his voice. He was breathing heavy, acting like he was very nervous, very scared about what he was going to say. And he started saying that aliens aren't what you think they are. They're actually interdimensional beings and they're here to manipulate us, here to lie to us. Which, you know, that's actually what I believe. If aliens are real, they're not little green men that come from other planets, but they exist here in a way that we can't see them, as if they're interdimensional or extra dimensional, however you want to put it. And yeah, they definitely don't have our best interest in mind. I don't think they do either. I think that they would probably want to communicate to us in a much more meaningful way than they do. And they sure as hell wouldn't be abducting us if they were friendly. You know, they'd be asking for volunteers. Like, I think that there's about 1 million people in like every country you could find that would volunteer for something like that. But anyways, through the call, right as he got to the really juicy part of the conversation, the call cuts out. The whole radio station actually went down. And either that was staged, you know, either Art Bell staged that and he shut down the whole station, or somebody was listening into that, right? And this is the way they sell it. Somebody's listening into that. He said something he wasn't supposed to say, and like Majestic 12 or the Men in Black or whatever, they shut the show down so that he wouldn't give out any more information. And then, yeah, somebody saying that they were this guy called back at a later show, you know, whether it was him or not, I don't know, because he wasn't doing the same voice thing. It's sort of hard to tell if it was exactly the same guy. But he claimed to be that guy, and he said that he was just acting. It was just a show, that he was just having fun, and it freaked the hell out of him when the radio station went down. And Art Bell said that there was actually a satellite that misaligned at that exact moment, and there was only like 3 or 4 different stations in the entire world that were affected by that, including the coast-to-coast one. So if that's true, that's really freaky that a coincidence like that happened, because that's not something that happens every day. Like entire radio stations don't just go down every day. So that's a really interesting story. Whether or not the guy's telling the truth, I mean, the whole thing could have been staged. Like, Art Bell could have been in on it, for all I know. But that was one of the most amazing moments in radio history. Maybe this could be a new series for you. I'd love to see more about these stories, because there are so many I probably don't know about, because I never listened to them while he was on the air. It was all secondhand on YouTube, mostly after his passing. May he rest in peace. Yeah, I really miss Art Bell. It's so tragic that he died, because he was such a staple, not just in radio and entertainment, but in the paranormal field in general. I, again, wouldn't be the Armored Skeptic today if it wasn't for him and people like him that were really pushing the envelope on what was accepted. I'm an absolute fan of the paranormal, the unexplained, the supernatural, and though I don't tend to believe most of those things, and I tend to play the skeptical side of those stories, I really just can't get enough of that stuff. And the last comment, Kay Hewitt says, "I don't believe in Jesus, but I called out for Jesus to help me. Something lifelong Christians always say." So that was from the succubus story, and okay, I agree. That's the part that I struggled with the most. So in the original video, I say in my breakdown that I found it really interesting that even though Art Bell was pressing on the guy and he was able to stay firm on his story, he stayed a little too firm. He seemed a little too inflexible, like he was sticking to a narrative. It felt like to me he was reading a script. And that the punchline of that story, and you know, Art Bell even used the word punchline because he could tell that the guy was being a little too rigid, so I think that he knew that he was just leading up to the whole Jesus thing. And sure enough, when he asked him the punchline, he's like, well, I asked for the protection of the blood of Jesus Christ, and then the succubus went away. And I've heard that a million times, you know? There are several stories, even stories I would say are credible, that end that way. I think that there might actually be something to that. Or at least I'm not at a point where I can't dismiss that. However, Art Bell, his show, because it was open lines, and all people would have to do is sort of play a character when they call in and tell a story, if they stuck to that sort of format, they could sell their ideas, they could sell their ideologies, their religions. And I believe that that guy was actually following a script. He was probably a very religious person, and he was just trying to sell the idea of Christianity and Jesus to people, and that he used that story as a tool for that, and used the Art Bell show as a platform to do that. And that guy was not the only guy that I think did that. I think that that was actually a pretty regular occurrence. Again, which is why I think Art Bell used the term punchline to draw that detail out in him. Well, Happy New Year, everybody. I wish you the best for 2021. I hope to see more of you in future videos. The Tell Me More series is going to take a little bit of a new turn for 2021. They're not going to be two-parter episodes anymore. I'm going to make them just one big video again. I think that that's what people like. I think that people like the long format better, but I think that people also like to know my skeptical side of the argument. They just want to get right to that. And honestly, I think that drawing those sort of stories out into 2 episodes is maybe a little bit too much for some people. I like to get to the punchline. You know, I want to do them more like that first video I did, the Missing 411, where I sort of tell the stories and I break them down, and then at the end, I give my skeptical answer, my skeptical reasoning behind the story, natural explanations for it, and then even the Occam's razor to finish it all off. But I am still going to focus on stories that I personally can't put my finger on, like that I can't dismiss, because even though I'm going to find answers for them that will sort of explain the possible reasoning or the possible methods that those things happened, those answers are not really going to satiate the story. And a really good example of that is our upcoming video on the crop circles. I know you're going to love that one, because the crop circle thing actually creeped the hell out of me once I started looking into it, seeing how long the phenomenon's been going on. just how many of these crop circles pop up every year across the world, even if the vast majority of them are sort of man-made, made by people, there are a handful that just can't be explained that way.
Thank you for watching. You guys know the drill. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Also, please consider supporting Armoured Media through Patreon and by buying our merch. The links are in the description.